Hello everyone, this is Pastor Duane Smith again, coming to you on what many call Maundy Thursday, and just wanted to share some things with you about this day. Jesus Christ on this Thursday evening, met with his disciples in the upper room, and he was having what we call the Last Supper with them. It was part of the Passover meal that he was having with them. And it says in the book of John, in chapter 13, it says, "Before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And during supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself about. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded." Now, when you read this, it seems kind of strange that Jesus, in the middle of their, or actually probably toward the end of their meal, or maybe even after the end of the meal, he gets up, it says, from supper, or during supper, and it says in verse 4, he rose from supper. All of a sudden he gets up and starts washing their feet. And when you're first reading that, you're wondering, why on earth would he do that? It seems a little strange to do that in the middle of a meal. But the book of Luke gives us some insight into that. In Luke chapter 22, this is during this meal. Listen to what happened with the disciples. Luke 22:24 says, "And there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be greatest." Luke 22:24 tells us that during this meal, they started arguing with each other about which one was the greatest. And I have a feeling that it was that argument that prompted the greatest one among them to really not say anything at first, but to get up, take a basin and a towel, and wash their feet. Can you imagine what happened in the midst of that discussion? Here's Jesus, their master, their rabbi, whom many of them at this point were already considering to be the Messiah. Here he is, doing the most humble of tasks. He's washing their feet. As we think about that, we have to remember that that very night, Jesus was going to be betrayed. He was going to have several trials that weren't really trials, and then the next morning was going to be executed. And Jesus was fully aware of all of this. And yet, in the midst of all the turmoil that had to be going through his mind, he takes the time to teach his disciples a very, very clear message. And that is that they needed to be humble, they needed to be servants. And he says to them in verse 12, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that also you should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, neither is one who is sent together than the one, he who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Now I'm going to stop right there in the midst of that passage. But Jesus is telling his disciples not just that they're supposed to wash each other's feet. He's saying to them, you have to be willing to serve. You need to never consider yourself as greater than anybody else. Here's the Son of God getting down on his knees and washing their feet. What a great testimony to them. And here he was also in the midst of, Judas being, going to betray him that night. He was going to be arrested. And yet here he gives them this great example. So I want to encourage you today that as you consider the events of Holy Week, as we call it, remember Jesus, our Savior, the one who died for us. Remember what the communion is all about, and that would be another discussion. But consider yourself not higher than your master, who was willing to get on his hands and knees and serve, because that is what he came to do. He came to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So I want to encourage you with that today as you consider Jesus Christ, our Savior.